From why South Asian women were barred from entering Canada to how gender roles worked within communities during the early 20th century. We're joined by a current PhD candidate to help shed light on the role of Canadian women in the Ghadar Party. Rishma Johal, author of the Ghadar Movement and its impact on South Asian Canadian women, and Moving Beyond the Citizen's Shadow, South Asian Canadian Women's Agency, helps to answer our questions today.
So as an undergraduate, I had declared my major as history just because I loved history. I really enjoyed it. But I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to specialize in or in what direction I wanted to take my research. So while I was, I think, still doing my undergraduate, I started hearing about these Punjabi pioneers, these Sikh pioneers, and these stories about South Asians arriving like 100 years ago. Sorry, not hundreds, but 100 years ago. And I was really surprised because in our community, I hadn't really heard discussions about these individuals. I hadn't heard much about the Ghadar at that time. I think now, the political atmosphere in Canada has definitely changed because our Prime Minister apologized for the Ghadar affair a few years back. But before that, it wasn't something that was talked about. We didn't cover it within our curriculum. It wasn't a part of our high school history lessons. So when I started to hear about this, I became more and more interested in it. And then as I started to read these books on early South Asian pioneers, I became more interested in women because they were clearly missing from this equation. Nobody was discussing what their lives were like. Until while I was doing my MA, I came across Madame Kam Minhas's book, Selected Stories of Our First Daughters, which remains like the only, I think other than my thesis, the only other book that discusses, early South Asian women's experiences within Canada. Yeah, so that explains some of my journey and how I actually came to write this article as well, because I started to research more about those women. And then I started to come across these documents that discussed the Ghadar movement and the exclusion of women from Canada, why South Asian women weren't being allowed to migrate to Canada. And, it's prevalent across documents of how important this was seen at the time.
Well, I guess naturally I then have to ask you, why were women kept out?
Yes. Okay, this is a really intriguing question because there isn't actually a specific ban that says women can't migrate to Canada. It's the way that the policies are set up. It essentially bans all South Asians from migrating to Canada. So basically what South Asian men are asking at the time after 1908, when the continuous journey provision is implemented, women just aren't able to migrate and neither are men. But the argument is that the South Asian men that are already residing within Canada should be allowed to have their wives, their mothers, women in their lives join them within Canada. And the response from Canadian society at large is that if we allow South Asian women to migrate, there's going to be a South Asian settlement. And we want this country to remain a white Canada forever. And we really can't have any South Asian women enter. So it's really interesting to see how gender becomes so specific at this time and really crosses over with racism and attempts to exclude a significant group, which was, they were essentially, South Asians also were attempting to establish a settlement. So their, rebuttal is sort of, this is why we need South Asian women here. We have no settlement and we want to establish a settlement. So it's interesting how women's place within society at that time becomes so significant to so many different people, and it's being used with different political agendas.
When do things then eventually change?
So basically in 1919, the law is altered to allow South Asian men who were already residing within Canada for their wives and mothers to come to Canada. And it's interesting that also is done, I argue, because of the Ghadar movement. So when the Ghadar movement happens within Canada, during like the years of 1913 and 1914, the community is very politically active. And when you look at the history of South Asians in Canada, where they're very much, a rule-abiding group. They aren't necessarily fighting for their rights immediately. So when they first come in, they've always been seen as the loyal British subjects. They were always supporting the British Raj within the Indian Ocean arena. So when they come to Canada, they are also shocked that they're now receiving second-class treatment. And then at the same time, when women aren't allowed to enter, this community starts to become more political. And it becomes, after 1919, you see after World War II ends, it's not the same, it's not as politically active as it was before that period. It's only like the Ghadar movement, all of the support it acquired really had a lot to do with the fact that these men couldn't, establish a settlement. Their household life was really in tatters without the women being there. And once the women are allowed to migrate, and a lot of the Ghadarites who were, you can say the most, revolutionary out of the community had also now migrated back to India. So you definitely see like this downfall of the movement, which you don't necessarily see in the States. In the States, there's still, the Ghadar magazine is still being published. Newspapers are still being published. And during Bhagat Singh's time, the Ghadar movement still exists within the United States. Whereas in Canada, it's really died out. It's, it's just a flame of those few years. And it really is interesting that, after 1919, when women are allowed to migrate, it just disintegrates. There isn't that level of support.
Okay, that's really interesting, because whilst you were talking, I was going to be like, well, hold on, like, if you're saying the Ghadar movement disintegrates, like, what's going on? But then you answered it in saying that there's a Canadian and a kind of an American...
There's a dichotomy, definitely a dichotomy.
Yeah, so I guess I'm talking on behalf of most people listening here, but like my general understanding of the Ghadar Party is very much just based around kind of what's coming out of California. And just in the last couple of seconds, you already illuminated the fact that the Ghadar movement is far bigger, and actually with certain kind of historical events that occur, it almost just disappears off the Canadian face. Could you just shed a little bit more light on how the Ghadar Party works, I guess, and why and how are there two different sections of it? Like, as in, I guess what I'm asking for is if you could give us like an overview of the Ghadar movement briefly, I guess, which is a massive question in itself, but you kind of hopefully know where I'm trying to get to with this.
I completely understand, because when I first started reading about, I came from the gendered perspective to study the Ghadar movement, and I was like, what is happening? Where is this person going? So there's actually so much mobility within the Ghadar movement itself. So Lala Hardyal, initially makes like the declaration of like the Ghadar movement in Astoria in Oregon. And there's a number of South Asians working within Oregon, and there's a huge gathering of these individuals. A meeting is held specifically for this reason. Then the Stockton Gurdwara, also with Baba Jwala Singh, creates a part, basically. So now they're all connected. So they're connected to Lala Hardyal, and they're starting the Ghadar movement within California. And he's actually moving up and down the coast. He's not staying in, Lala Hardyal is not staying in one place. He's moving up and down the coast. And as he goes, he's giving lectures to communities of South Asians working within the region in different places. And then in BC, there's Taraknath Das, who has also now been fleeing from different places and arrives in Vancouver. And he's also, very much giving lectures to the community about the Ghadar movement and its importance. So these individuals don't necessarily, they're actually, I think, giving information about the movement in different ways, and they don't necessarily always correlate. So there's differences between communities, where they're going, how people in those communities are now taking in the information and how they're acting on it. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of heterogeneity depending on which community they're working with. It's difficult to see. Actually, one of the reasons that's seen as the failure for the movement is the fact that they weren't as organized. So they're very much trying to ensure that this rhetoric is publicly available and available to many different people, but there's never really an outright plan on what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. There's right before World War I, they definitely say that, oh, we all need to raise up our arms, against the British as soon as the war breaks out. But there is no identified specific plan on exactly what needs to be done. So a lot of South Asians just, go back to the British, in the Indian subcontinent at this point. and they're arrested immediately because the British already, they've read the papers. They know that a bunch of South Asians are arriving, and they plan to raise up arms. But the plans are very small, and they require a sense of organization that is missing from the movement to an extent.
A massive what if question. But like, if for some reason they had been more organized and there was a better structural management, or whatever you want to call it, obviously I would assume the Ghadar movement would have been more efficient, but like, what would you assume be some of the outcomes from them just being more organized?
Well, I think what has happened eventually, what I'm seeing as I was just at the Bancroft Library and I'm reading more papers on the Ghadar movement, and as I read, what I realize is that basically these are the same tactics that are used years later. So before India actually gains independence, it's the fact that the army is used. Individuals from the army are used at that time within World War II to stand up against the British, although that movement is small. Again, this movement is also attempted earlier on. So even before World War I, there are letters being sent to soldiers within the British army that you need to rise up against the British. You shouldn't be fighting for them. You should be fighting against them. So what we see, I think, later on is a much more vigorous attempt at the same tactics that are used earlier on. It's a bit more structured, a bit more organized, but I still wouldn't necessarily call it as structured and organized later on. There are just so many groups within the Ghadar movement in the second period that it's overwhelming for the British, I think, to contain. Whereas in North America, it was at that time a much smaller group. But what we see later on is, at the same time, there are revolutionaries in Bengal, there are revolutionaries in Punjab, there are revolutionaries all over India, Marathis, who are standing up against the British in their own ways. There's Gandhi. There's so much more happening than just what we see, I think, within North America in this period.
No, definitely. One question, just out of curiosity, would it be fair to say the Ghadar movement is one big, like, as in you spoke earlier about the heterogeneity of everything, but I would assume from that then there isn't like, it's not like one big movement. It's not like a cohesive. There are just loads of different groups who are like, as in, I guess then what my next question is, how do these groups lay claim to being Ghadars? Like, as in, is it a name that is bestowed, or is it a title that you're just like, yeah, I'm part of the group today? Like, how does it work?
So they remain connected. So the newspapers are being smuggled in from region to region. So they're all reading the same papers. And depending on which leader is in which area, they're usually in touch. They're usually writing letters to one another. So many of the times when they're getting caught by British agents as well, it's those letters that they're sending to one another. There will be an individual who has been marked as, a troublemaker. And as soon as letters are being sent from that person, as soon as they see, oh, now this is being sent to, this clerk in BC, they must be involved too. Now their name is marked. So, it's interesting to see how they're working. And sometimes it's fascinating to think at that time, it's not the same as technology that we have. Yet they were, maintaining contact. They managed to hold these massive meetings where they invite people from different areas. So during these actually mass meetings too, I would say to a certain extent, there was an agenda that was built around the Ghadar. But yeah, the planning definitely lacked, I would say. It's interesting to see. I don't like to say that definitively it was like this. There's certainly I think exemptions in some cases, but they remained connected. That's one thing that's amazing, that whether it was in Manila in the Philippines, whether it was Hawaii, whether it was China, the movement remained connected from place to place, and they were definitely in touch and writing to one another. But when it comes to, I think, daily workers, daily laborers who were supporting the movement, that case isn't the same. That's where those distinctions become more obvious.
One question, and I promise we'll dive further into the paper in a second. It's just that you mentioned something earlier that piqued my interest, which was about how even during the Ghadar time, during World War One, there's this conversation going on between the community about whether you should be fighting for or against the British. And that's obviously a conversation that still echoes around today within the community under obviously different terms, but still it's relatively the same as in being part of a nation state army. What are some of the arguments that are being put forward that you've come across, like within like, the research that you've done? And is it like, are some of the arguments pretty much the same things that the community still talks about today, or have things kind of slightly changed, like the arguments or the reasons for why?
For the reasons for why they should support the British?
Or shouldn't, I guess, like either way, whichever way is the kind of the research falls, like what are the reasons and why?
Yeah. I would say the reasons have certainly changed, because a lot of the rhetoric at that time is concerned with how South Asians are being treated in Canada, especially what I'm analyzing. So the fact that, you know, they aren't being treated the same as white Canadians. They don't have the same rights. They can't vote. You know, one of the slogans actually they use when they're petitioning the government of Canada is "Give us our votes and give us our wives," which, you know, those are their two main concerns at that time, and it's pretty obvious. So I think from that, it's you know, today we don't compare. Those arguments wouldn't be the same.
So they're very much just like, we're not going to fight for you guys because you're not letting our wives into the country. Like, as in to simplify this, what your research, not the whole Ghadar movement, before someone listening to this clips it out and tries to like misrepresent the argument. But like, for want of better words, that's what's going on in this kind of really small subsection that
Yes,
you're analyzing.
yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely. In the larger movement, there are so many more reasons given, right? It has to do with the fact that people are starving in India, the fact that the British very much had the opportunity to end that starvation, and they're not. So there's actually, you know, these massive reasons of what is happening in India that are being used by the larger movement. This is a very small, subsection of community.
Diving further into your paper, then, like, how do you then approach the topic of gendered understandings in, I guess, South Asian culture? But would I be going a step too far and saying Punjabi Sikh culture, or is the South Asian community in Canada far more diverse than just Punjabis and Sikhs?
The community in Canada, you know, was predominantly Punjabi Sikh. But it's whenever I'm discussing the Ghadar movement, I don't like to say just Punjabi Sikh, because, you know, it's very evidently multicultural, what would I say? Not multi-ethnic, but it's a movement that involves very much Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. And some of them don't necessarily say that they belong to any religion. And many of them are also communists. So it's difficult to actually say that it was a specific multi-ethnic community, because you very much see, again, the heterogeneity within that community, even though it's such a small group of people at that time. I would say culturally, there are similarities between most South Asians, because we always say that these are patriarchal societies, and they follow patrilineal, you know, forms of the male inheriting land, and also the women getting married and, you know, moving into the men's homes, and lineage is also dictated by, you know, the male line, not necessarily the female line. So for those reasons, South Asian cultures already have similarities, despite, you know, religious differences or even local differences, traditional differences.
You were talking, I think, briefly at it, and it kind of connects to something that you mentioned in your paper about how the British Zamindar system and kind of the division of labor between men and women kind of exacerbates the gender division, I guess. Like, what, I guess my question is kind of threefold almost, in a sense, which is, what's happening before the British turn up? What do the British do? And then how does that impact things moving forward, and especially in relation to your work?
Yeah. So this isn't a pattern just in India, but with British colonialism, this happens in many different regions. Essentially, you know, the way that the community is set up and culturally is more or less egalitarian, you know, especially I think among lower castes, among people of lower classes, women are having to work, they're working. So the relations between men and women are somewhat more egalitarian, somewhat more equal. But when like the Zamindar system is instituted, that division of labor, where the labor for cash crops is divided from the labor that's done for the production of food, which would be done by women, all of a sudden, this idea of working for cash crops and the work that men are doing, becomes favored. That's seen as superior. And that's one of the things that I actually discussed on how changes in gender occur. But Anshu Malhotra has actually written this great book on how British colonialism essentially affected women in Punjab, and not necessarily just lower class women, but middle class and upper class women as well. So before British interventions within Punjab, women were involved within the public sphere to an extent, and they were involved in a lot of syncretic traditions. So we would say that the distinction between Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim traditions was not necessarily completely divided. It was very much something that was crossed over. So women who would, they would go to Hindu priests, they would go to peers, they would also go to the Gurdwara. There wasn't that separation, but that was giving women a lot of freedom, where they were, they would travel to these different places. They would go in groups of women, and their involvement within the public sphere wasn't seen as an issue. It wasn't seen as something negative. But as a response to British colonial rule, the Arya Samaji movements began, the Akali movements began. And with those movements, women are really, they're taught to stay within the home. They shouldn't be involved in these movements. And all of a sudden, I think that sense of freedom that these women had is sort of taken away, even though there are also movements that are, favoring women's education and supporting them in other ways. We see this shift, especially within the public sphere, of what women were allowed to do and what now is thought that they shouldn't do or, shouldn't participate in, which is seen as a response to British colonialism. It's not necessarily direct British involvement, but it's the way that these communities are responding to ideas about women that the British are implementing. And much of it has to do with also the fact that the British were trying to justify their rule as we're saving Indian women. There's sati, women are being, burned alive, and they're using these types of ideas to justify their colonial rule at home. And now, you can't, we see why this response would have happened with Arya Samajis and Akalis and other social political movements at the time, because they want to say, we don't do this, no. So we're not Hindus anymore. We're Sikhs. We don't do this. Yeah. So you see how all of this happens and how British colonialism essentially ends up influencing women in many negative ways. So this actually, the Ghadar movement, this pocket where these men are vehemently supporting South Asian women and they want their women to migrate to Canada, is really interesting because it's right in that period. It's within, from like 1908 to like 1919, essentially.
No, definitely. My brain's going nuts and trying to think. There's so many questions that I want to ask you off the back of like what we're talking about, and I'm just trying to like filter through which ones and like yeah. I guess just on the point of the Ghadar's support for women in this period, and I don't know whether it's just like as in I'm jumping to conclusions, but isn't even their support for women based on just lines of just having a family and creating kids? It's not really based on the assumption of like bring them over so they can have a job, or like as in the reasons fit with the patriarchy of it all. So like surely that is kind of in summary what's going on. And once the women are let in, they're like, yeah, cool, like job done. We don't need to like the Ghadar movement doesn't need to, in this case, not overall, but in this case, the Ghadar movement's kind of like, well, yeah, all right, like we've got what we want now.
Absolutely. This is a part of I wrote about this a little bit, but the thing is that this is a moment where we would say, we're maternal feminists, where anti-racist feminists would say that the family is a key node for South Asian women who are coming into a community which is racist and sexist, but the fact that they have their family, they have their community, means a lot more to them. It's a form of survival in a community that's already hostile. Family life is specifically important to these women as well. It's not something that they are trying to reject or they are trying to fight against. They are supporting those values of care, and it's something that they themselves are also are very much supporting. They're not necessarily negating or trying to fight against that. So for them, it holds value, and what holds value for women is significant. So it's not just I completely understand what you're saying, and it's definitely something I looked into as well. But for that time, for that period, even looking at women in this way is significant. It's important. It portrays that they held a significant value, rather than facing misogyny and sexism where their work is completely devalued. This even if we just look at that dichotomy between the cash crops and the production for food, where women's work was being devalued. In this instance, we see women's work as being valued. It is now significant. Their work within the family is seen as essential for a society. It's not necessarily seen as something that's, that can be disregarded. It's not important. I actually write at one point, I think that the fact that these men had to do women's work for so long may have actually made them realize how essential women's role was and what that work entailed, the importance of family life.
A question off the back of this, and this is just the question based off two things actually. One is just the fact that if the men are in another country for X number of years before their respective partners turn up, I'm sure some of them stray from the straight and narrow. And secondly, I've also heard, and I've not read any research, but I think I can't remember who, and I should really double check, but I'm sure on a previous podcast we've had a guest who's spoken about how a lot of the early settlers in Canada had essentially two lives or kind of a second family. In your research, have you come across any of that? And what is kind of going on? Like if you are able to share any light on that kind of area.
Yes, definitely. I think that's expected from bachelor societies in general. So Nayan Shah has written this book, which is actually based on South Asian men who were in homosexual relations with other men. And there were many arrests that happened in Canada, that happened in the States. And those files and that information is there. Even, when I was doing research in Oregon, I came across a number of cases of sodomy. So that was definitely one aspect of society and the lifestyle that some individuals were living. Other than that, I've also, when I was conducting research in Victoria, in cases of wills, I found files where, there's a Canadian wife and there's an Indian wife, and there's issues with where, the estate would go. So definitely, yeah, it's really interesting to read these cases and see how these individuals were living multiple lives. Now, there were community leaders who, very much frowned upon these things. So they're saying it, they just make a number of lectures which talk about immorality, and they don't specify what, but you have these ideas of this is what's happening within the community, and they're really trying to stop it from going further.
Justin, in terms of your actual research, it sounds absolutely mind-boggling, and there's so much I would love to ask you about it. But what has your research entailed, and where have you ended up going to, and what are some of the interesting archives or collections you've had the pleasure to kind of visit?
Mm-hmm. So I was just at the Bancroft Library and National Archives in California. I did research at the National Archives in Seattle as well, and the State Archives in Oregon, the BC Archives, and where else? The Coquitlam Archives, many of the local archives in BC, actually. I won't name them all because there's a lot. But yeah, I've been doing like archival research all across basically the Pacific coast, which is where most South Asians lived at that time. Now, my PhD research is different from this paper and from the research, but it looks at early South Asian migrants and intersections with Indigenous communities. So how the arrival of South Asians influenced Indigenous communities at that time. What were some of the interactions that occurred with them? Any cases of marriages. I mean, I've only come across like a handful, but yeah, it's different, but it's definitely covering a lot about South Asian migration.
No, it sounds really interesting, and hopefully once you've finished, we can have a second podcast just talking about that, because that is definitely something that I'd love to dive into. Just then with the research for this paper in particular, like what were some of the like documents perhaps, or like what was it that you were coming across? Was it mainly just letters or newspapers, obviously with the Ghadar Party obviously being famous for that? Like, but what is some of the ephemera that you're dealing with?
It was actually some of these lectures. One of the lectures, I think it was Dr. Sundar Singh, gave this lecture about the importance of home life, and Christian Canada is denying them the right to live. I don't remember the exact words. I think it is to live like home life, something along those lines. Anyways, I'm definitely misquoting that. But and the immorality in the community. Obviously, this is going to happen if Canada doesn't change its ways. And then I came across other similar quotes, in secondary sources where they were almost threatening the British, like, if you don't let, our wives come to Canada, there's going to be upheaval in India and you're going to basically lose your Raj. And I started coming across like these snippets here and there. And then I started looking at more sources that were specifically discussing this. And I came across Tanya Dasgupta's article, which actually looked at South Asian women to an extent and their migration. And she mentioned that, the Ghadar Party at that time, actually there was a correlation with the support that they received within Canada and women not being allowed to migrate.
We've spoken about women and the Ghadar Party and in relation to being allowed into Canada. Do you ever come across more information about these women? And like once they get to Canada, how do their lives pan out? Because I almost feel like we've just spoken about them as a group rather than as like the people that they were and like the lives they lived. So like I'm sure there's plenty that you could tell us, but like some of them that perhaps have stuck out to you, like what did you come across?
I think one of my favorite stories, I'm from Abbotsford, so it's actually from the Abbotsford Heritage Gurdwara, Mahinder Thandi, who was their treasurer and longest serving treasurer at the Gurdwara and very much a community leader. And people like in the community, if you talk to pioneers now or you talk to any of these, the older generation, they remember her and they talk about her. And she's seen very much as a leader within the community, which I think if we think of South Asian women at that time is rare. People wouldn't necessarily remember that. But I love her story for that reason. And she's someone that always comes up when I think of South Asian women who were very much involved within the community. Other than that, what I think stories that I've personally, when I read them, they make me very happy. And I think it's something that a lot of people would resonate with a lot of women actually, is narratives that, the South Asian, early South Asian pioneer women's daughters have shared, discussing how, their mothers would gather together at the Gurdwara, how they'd, prepare the langar, how they'd, prepare different sweets together. There'd be specific days where they'd go shopping collectively. And you kind of see the way that the community building that they did at that time, which, was basically what the men wanted. Like, they were arguing for that this is missing within our lives. And you see how the women arrived, especially in Baldi and areas that, that were remote, on how they gathered together and established that community and raised their children collectively. And, they were there for one another. Those it's always, I think, wonderful to hear those stories and see them being shared.
In terms of your research, were there any challenges or kind of hurdles that you faced? Like, from the sound of it, it seems like there's a absolute abundance of archival information and kind of data on your doorstep. As in, like, the fact that you were like, I can't list every single place that I've been to, kind of goes to show that there must be just so much, which in itself is really interesting, and I guess a whole topic in its own right. But was there kind of any, I can't imagine, but was there any hurdles or anything that you kind of came up against?
Yeah, definitely. Finding sources on women is difficult, and about women is difficult. But the fact that I was able to find these citations like consistently was a surprise for me. Because I didn't necessarily, because when I was doing my research for my MA, it was based on women's citizenship experience, so South Asian women's citizenship experience. So I'm looking for stories about them, by them, and it was really difficult. And this was a tangent project, so like I came across these like citations, and I'm like, oh, let's look into this. And I didn't expect to find all the information that I found. And I continue to. So even now when I'm doing my research, I keep finding sources talking about this. And I'm amazed, because I don't think going in at that time I expected that to happen. Because I had actually been, facing difficulties trying to find narratives about women by women. I actually ended up doing 3 oral histories interviews at that time, just to supplement the amount of information that I had found for my MA thesis. But for when it came to the Ghadar movement, and specifically this subject, there was an abundance of material. I think for anyone actually doing research on Ghadar, there is so much material, especially if you can speak Punjabi. So in California, there's loads of information and loads of material, because they really have saved anything about the party that they could find. So yeah, I would encourage them to go to California, because it's definitely worth the trip. Yeah, there's boxes and boxes of materials on the Ghadar movement.
Yeah, no, it just stood out when you were mentioning all of the places that you've had the pleasure to go and visit, and I was like, wow. Even just for like, I wouldn't say I'm a massive, like, I'm not like a huge history nerd about the Ghadar movement, but just to hear that there is that much information, like, well, hold on, there must be like absolute treasure troves of stuff. So yeah, anyone listening, like, please encourage. Yeah.
Also the British Library. I spent 5 weeks at the British Library, and there's loads of information there as well.
Was the information particularly different that you were finding in the British Library compared to what you were finding over in America? And like, what were some of the differences?
Yes. So everything at the British Library is basically what the British are keeping track of. So, and it's like internal information where they're speaking to one another about what's happening and who they're keeping an eye on. And then they'll include like an excerpt from the newspaper and like highlight what they think is dangerous, and then send it to the next person. Whereas in California, it's the opposite side. It's the Ghadar leaders speaking to one another, and it's they had like a lot of newspapers. I can't say off the top of my head from which year to which year, but they had daily newspapers from the Ghadar movement. So you see, it's kind of like that was like top down. This is from like the bottom up, basically.
Yeah. Do the British ever keep an eye on any of the women, or is it just the men that are an issue for them?
Mainly they're keeping track of men. I don't think I can't think of any instances where it's found specific, other than Madame Kam, who comes up, and she's, I think, the one individual that they're keeping track of. But other than that, I don't remember. I think even Gulab Kaur, I don't think they mentioned her. Yeah, I don't remember coming across her.
I hope I heard you correctly. Did you say Madame Kam?
Yes.
Because that is a badass name, Madame Kam. Like, that's pretty bad, boy. I can't let you get away with just saying it and not then asking you, like, what is her story? Because I'm sure she's done something to have the moniker Madame, but like, what's going on there?
So she was basically an Indian revolutionary, and I've honestly focused very little on her, but she's someone who keeps coming up when I'm reading letters by Ghadar leaders, because they do write to her pretty actively, and she's in Germany, so for a period of time, not always, but for a period of time she's in Germany, and they're going there and they're like hiding there from time to time. So I come across these like mentions, but I couldn't talk about her at length. I have not read that much about her, but from my understanding, of course, she was an Indian revolutionary, and she also seems to have fled to Germany for some time.
Just kind of then getting towards the end of all of the kind of people that you must have come across during your research, and some of the kind of, even perhaps some of the people that aren't necessarily named, but you can kind of infer that they're being discussed. Like, who would you love to have been able to go back in time and just sit with and pick their brain? And what would you ask them?
Wow, this is a very tough question, because I feel like for anyone interested in the Ghadar movement, I feel like the obvious answer would be Lala Hardayal. Like, I would want to know, like, in terms of the organization too, and the plan, like, what is the plan? Like, what did he envision exactly? I mean, he's written like different versions of what he's envisioned, but very much on like what as like, I think in a whole scale, like how he wanted to see a free India, what that would have been, that would be super interesting. But I think as, a feminist, I have to say Gulab Kaur, because she's like the only woman really recognized for being involved within the Ghadar movement other than Madame Kam. And I'd want to know more about what her involvement, what that looked like, more about what she thought about the movement itself and why it was essential. What would have been her vision? What would have been a woman's vision for a free India? What would that have looked like? Yeah. So I'll pick two.
No, I'm more than happy for you. Just on like, far you say Gulab Kaur, isn't even their inclusion as being like revolutionaries, quote unquote, isn't that itself kind of a step against the patriarchal system? Because as you were saying earlier, like, this division of labor was made so that actually like women were to stay at home and do certain things, whereas obviously it's not like the woman's place, so to speak, to be a revolutionary. So how does that fit into everything that we've discussed since, where it kind of seems as though the community's almost accepted how gender should function? Like, how does that then connect to that?
I That's a very interesting question. Well, I think in terms of, I feel like it's not set in stone that gender should just be exist in this way. And I think especially when women come to Canada, there's definitely an understanding that that women's place isn't just necessarily within the home. Women have to adapt, and in many cases, if their husbands aren't alive or they're gone for some time, the women end up making all of the household decisions at that point. And even when I was looking through these early settler women's stories, they're in charge of financial of the financials of the finances of the household. Essentially, they're taking on tasks that they might not have been able to take in India. Moreover, they're not in an extended family household anymore. It is just the husband, wife, and kids. So they don't have a mother-in-law. They don't have a father-in-law. They're not answering to these extended family members the way that they would have in India. So they're already experiencing a greater amount of freedom when they come here. So we see in some ways gender relations change. And I wouldn't say they were necessarily equal or egalitarian, but there's shifts as soon as they're, coming to Canada. It doesn't remain exactly the same as it had back home. You could ask something else. I lost my train of thought. I wanted to expand on another point.
I had asked about how, so you had mentioned like you would want to meet Gulab Kaur, and I was just wondering, how do female revolutionaries fit into the kind of the social cultural aspect of women's place, or kind of the view of how gender should function at this point? And also, I guess, is some of that hybridization, or kind of the fact that there are certain forms of certain views of gender, is sometimes that being usurped actually the fact that, like, for argument's sake, they come from an egalitarian, like, so back in Punjab it was more egalitarian, or the fact that they, for argument's sake, come from a Sikh household and there's principles of egalitarianism in that, like, what is perhaps driving some of these people to almost challenge, I guess it's not necessarily a direct challenge, but in some ways it is challenging gender norms?
Yes. So I think the answer to that is actually the Ghadar movement, because the Ghadar leaders like Lala Hardayal specifically are trying to implement gender equality. Even if, I always say the idea and the rhetoric of implementing gender equality is actually different from doing it. So in the Ghadar movement, we see the rhetoric. It's certainly there. And there's definitely attempts to have women become involved within the Ghadar movement. Bajwala Singh actually instituted a scholarship program at Berkeley. And this was sort of a Ghadar movement decision to do this on purpose, so that when students from India came, they had set 10 scholarships for these individuals that they would now, recruit them for the movement, and they would be, a massive way of supporting it. And when they send like the advertisements, I just read one of these last week, and the advertisement specifically highlights, we want members of both sexes. So they're trying to recruit women at this point. But I feel like if my criticism was, even that recruitment is very whoever reads this newspaper might see this advertisement. There isn't an actual attempt on the ground to have women join the movement, which I feel like that part is lacking. But otherwise, even in Vancouver, when I was reading excerpts of the Ghadar newspapers, there are a few places where they mention we need to recruit women. They need to, be a part of the cause. They can be the leaders of this movement and of Indian independence. So we see this rhetoric and this attempt to be open to having women join the movement. But I feel like there are limitations to how that would be done and what that would mean if more women had attempted to join.
I've got to the end of all of the questions that I had hoped that we can get through, and I think we've gotten through them. I just wanted to double check, is there anything that you feel like we've missed out, or anything that you want to just mention before we wrap up?
I think you had asked me about, society at that time. We've discussed a lot about gender and how gender is looked at. And I think it's always important just to remember that when we're discussing these facts, that we're looking at a historical period. So sometimes we try to use our opinions from today and sort of implement them to what was happening back in the day. But our society has changed and our expectations have changed. So I think understanding how revolutionary all of this already would have been for that time is important to remember and just highlight.
And that's the end of another intriguing podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating this podcast. If you're passionate about the work I'm doing and want to support it, consider becoming a paid YouTube member to unlock some cool features, or join our Patreon community. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!